This is Shannon from the Story Center. I'm the program manager, and I'm here today to introduce Jim Two Crows Wallen for Stories for the Family. Jim Two Crows Wallen is a freelance oral historian who grew up listening to his grandfather share family history and tall tales. Jim discovered his own gift for storytelling more than 30 years ago as a church youth leader and has traveled to 4 continents and 46 states, telling his collection of carefully researched stories featuring pioneers, mountain men, pirates, and Native Americans. Jim dresses for his parts, researching and hand designing all of his own clothing for historical accuracy. All right, Jim, take it away.
Osta, Sanalehi, Osio Dohichu. Good afternoon and hello, how are you? Today we're going to be sharing some stories from Native Americans. And the first story I want to share with you today comes from the Jalagi. And if the Jalagi were here today, they would introduce themselves by saying, Osta, Sanalehi, Osio Dohichu. Good afternoon and hello, how are you? So our first story comes from the Cherokee people who originally lived on the East Coast of the United States, but eventually made their way into what is now the state of Oklahoma and the very southern part of Missouri. And this story is called Skunk and Blue Jay. And this is the way the story goes. A long time ago, way back at the very beginning of time, the Cherokee people said all of the birds and all of the animals could talk to one another. Now, at this time, when the birds and the animals could talk to one another, they were always getting into arguments. They were always arguing over who was the best, who was number one, the birds or the animals. It got to be so bad that they knew something had to be done. So they went out into a big field and they drove 2 wooden posts at this end of the field, went to the other end of the field and drove 2 more wooden posts. Kind of looked like football goalposts today. They took a small piece of leather like my jacket's made out of. They cut a piece out in a circular pattern and sewed it together until it made about the size and shape of a baseball today. Now, the way they were going to play this game, they were going to toss the ball in the air, and whoever caught it would either run or fly past their goal line and score a point. And the first team to score 12 points would win the game. They would be number one from then on. All of the animals were gathered at their goal. All of the birds were gathered at their goal. All of the birds said, we're going to win the game. We're going to be number one. Out there in this Facebook land, if you think the birds are going to win the game, just go ahead and cheer. Every time the birds score a goal, I want to hear you cheer. All of the animals were gathered at their goal. And all of the animals said, we're going to win the game. We're going to be number one. Whenever the animals score a goal, you think they're going to win, I want to hear you cheer. We'll see who can cheer the loudest. It was time for the game to begin. But there are 2 things I must tell you before I can start the story. Number 1, you can only cheer for your team. You cannot boo the other team. That's disrespectful to the Native American, and I cannot finish the story. Number 2, some of you did not choose one side or the other, and I know how this game ends, and it doesn't end in a tie. So you must choose either the birds or the animals. It was time for the game to begin. The ball was tossed into the air, and the mighty hawk flew out of the sky. And Hawk caught the ball, and Hawk flew past the goal line, and the bird scored the first goal. All of the animals said that was just beginner's luck. It wouldn't happen again. The ball was tossed into the air, and this time, Awayuste, Little Deer caught the ball, and Little Deer ran as fast as a deer can run, and the animals scored, and the score was tied 1-1. Whoever would score 12 points first would win the game. The ball was tossed into the air, and this time the bird scored, and then the animal scored, and then the bird scored, and the animal scored, and the bird scored, and the animal scored, the bird scored, and the animal scored, the bird scored, and the animal scored. You guys are good at this. Finally, the score was tied, 11-11. Whoever would score the next point would win the game. They would be number one from then on. The ball was tossed into the air, and the mighty hawk flew out of the sky. And Hawk caught the ball, and Hawk was flying, and all of a sudden, Bear saw that the birds were going to win the game. Bear took his mighty paw, rah, and when he did, Hawk ducked underneath Bear's paw and dropped the ball right on the back of the animal's secret weapon, the skunk. The skunk started making his way to the goal line of the animals. All of the birds were sitting around in the trees saying, "You go stop him, you go stop him. I don't want to stop him, you go stop him." None of the birds wanted to stop that smelly skunk. But finally, Turkey Buzzard said, "Well, I'll go. I'll stop him. I'll go. I'll stop him." And Turkey Buzzard flew out of the trees. He flew down in front of Skunk. He took his long talons, his long claws, and he raked them right across Skunk's back, causing those white stripes that all skunks still have on their backs to this day. But when he got past Skunk, he looked underneath his wing to see if he got the ball from Skunk's back. And when he did, Skunk raised up his tail and sprayed Turkey Buzzard right in the top of the head. Turkey Buzzard flew over to the trees. He landed in the trees and he said, "This is horrible. Ugh." And he began plucking feathers out of the top of his head. And that is why, to this day, turkey buzzards always fly by themselves, why they smell so bad, and why they have no feathers in the top of their head. Well, Owl said, "I'll go. I'll stop him. I'll go. I'll stop him." Now, Owl was indeed a very wise bird, and Owl hoped to sneak up on Skunk from behind. But as he got close to Skunk, Skunk raised up his tail and sprayed Owl right in the face. Owl flew over to the trees. He landed in the trees and he said, "Oh, this is terrible." And he took his wings and he rubbed and he rubbed and he rubbed until he rubbed those two large circles all owls still have around their eyes to this day. Skunk was getting closer and closer to the goal line. It looked like the animals were going to win the game. When Blue Jay, the squawkingest of all the birds, Blue Jay said, "I'll go, I'll stop him, I'll go, I'll stop him." I see some of you have been awakened by that Blue Jay before. Blue Jay flew out in front of Skunk and he began to dart back and forth and back and forth. And as he was starting back and forth, Hummingbird, the smallest of all the birds, Hummingbird flew out of the trees. He flew down, he took the ball from Skunk's back, and Hummingbird flew past the goal line, and the birds won the game. Blue Jay was so proud of what he had done, he went around bragging about it all day long. "The birds are number one. I did it. I did it. The birds are number one. I did it. I did it." He was so proud of what he had done. He went all throughout the forest putting up signs to let everyone know that the birds are number one. Still to this day, if you go out into the woods and you find a blue jay's nest, do not take it down, but look, hanging from the bottom of it will always be a string in the shape of the number one to let you know the birds really are number one. Wado, thank you. Our next story comes from the people who lived along the Missouri River and all the tributaries of the Missouri River. And so there were many different versions of this story. This is my favorite. It's called Essopon. Essopon was out hunting one day. Now, maybe you don't know who Essopon was. You probably, if I tell you, you'll know who this animal is. He has a black mask on his face and he has rings on his tail. The Native Americans, they didn't call him raccoon. They called him Essopon. And Essopon had been out hunting one day. And he was running along and he was thinking about some of his very favorite foods. And as he was going along, he remembered right down at the edge of the creek, underneath a flat rock, lives a little green animal that goes ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. Essopon loved frogs. He thought maybe he could catch some frogs to take home for his supper. He started running faster to the creek. He was about halfway there when he remembered another one of his favorite foods lives out in the middle of the creek at the very bottom. And his shell he lives inside of in the morning opens up very slowly and closes very slowly at night. He's called clam. Essopon loved clams. He thought maybe they're a lot better than ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. Maybe I can catch some clams to take home to my family. He was running now as fast as he could. He was almost to the creek when he remembered his very favorite food of all. This animal lives right at the edge of the creek and he lives under flat rocks. He's about this long and he has little pinchers on the end of his hands. He's called crawdad. Essopon loved crawdads. They were a lot better than ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. He ran down to the creek, stuck his hand underneath that flat rock, and when he did, Crawdad reached out and pinched him right on his hand. "Oh," said Essopon. "Oh, that really hurt. I guess Crawdad does not want to play today." But Essopon got to thinking, if he caught one little crawdad and took that home, would that be enough food for him and his entire family? No. So he had to come up with a plan. He came up with an idea. He thought maybe if I go out in the creek and lay on my back and stick all four legs up in the air, maybe all of the crawdads will come out to see me. And when all of the crawdads come out, I'll scoop them up and take them home and make them, and my wife have her make me my very favorite food of all, crawdad Florentine. You know what that is, don't you? That's crawdads with spinach. Yum, yum. Well, he went out in the middle of the creek. He laid on his back and stuck all four legs up in the air and just stayed that way. Well, after a while, Crawdad came out from underneath his flat rock. And he went over and he poked Essopon. But Essopon, he did not move and he did not say anything. "Whoa, I better go tell all my friends and relatives. I think there's something wrong with Essopon." And Crawdad made his way down the creek, yelling at all of his friends and relatives, "Come and see, come and see. You got to check out Essopon. I think there's something wrong." He made his way all the way down to the very end of the creek where the great Sagamaw lived, the chief of all of the crawdads. The great Sagamaw came out from underneath his flat rock and he said, "What is this I hear?" "You better come and see. There's something wrong with Essopon. He's laying on the bank, on the bottom of the bank at the river, and he's got all four legs stuck up in the air. There's something wrong. You better come check it out." "I better check this out for myself." And the great Sagamaw, with all of the little crawdads following along behind, made their way back to where Essopon was laying on his back with all four legs up in the air. Something does not look quite right. I think we should do a test. Do I have any brave crawdads out there who want to help me out? If you're a brave crawdad, stand up right now. And when I tell you to, we're going to reach out and we're going to pinch Essopon. And we're going to pinch him right on the end of his tail. All those very brave crawdads. Are you a brave crawdad? All those very brave crawdads, they reached out, they pinched Essopon right on the back of his tail. Oh, it hurt really bad. But Essopon, he did not move, and he did not say anything. Oh, but it hurt really bad. We shall do another test. Do I have any other brave crawdads out there? If you're a brave crawdad, stand up. This time, we're going to pinch Essopon right on his belly. And those very brave crawdads, they went out and they pinched Essopon right on his belly. Oh, it hurt really bad. But Essopon, he did not move and he did not say anything. Oh, but it hurt really bad. We shall do one last test. This is your last chance. If you're a brave crawdad, stand up, and this time we're going to go over and we're going to pinch Essopon right on the end of his nose and give it a twist. And the brave crawdads, they went out. They pinched Essopon right on the end of his nose, gave it a twist. Oh, it hurt really bad. But Essopon did not move, and he did not say anything. Oh, but it hurt really bad. We shall do a victory dance. And those crawdads begin to dance. Can you dance like the crawdads? And those crawdads, they begin to dance, and they danced, and they danced, and they danced, and they danced, until their little crawdad legs were too tired to dance anymore. And when they were too tired to dance anymore, Essopon, who had been laying on his back with all four legs stuck up in the air, he jumped up and he scooped up all of those crawdads. And he tried to scoop up some more, and he tried to scoop up some more. But that day, when Essopon went home, he hadn't caught even one crawdad. And that night, his wife, she had to order in pizza. And that's the end of that story. Our next story is going to take us out to the Rocky Mountains, out on the plains and the mountainous areas where the Native Americans lived. Early in our history of our country, the mountain men, kind of like I'm dressed today, these mountain men, they went out, and during the wintertime, they couldn't hunt and trap. It was too cold, and many times they would stay with Native American nations. And sure enough, they would learn the stories, because during the winter is when Native Americans tell the story. During the summer, they're too busy planting and they're too busy hunting, so they don't have time to tell stories in the summertime. So it's in the wintertime that they tell these stories. And this story is told from many Plains Indian nations. This one's my favorite. It's called One Day and One Night. A long time ago, way back at the very beginning of time, it was said that we did not always have one day followed by one night, followed by one day, followed by one night. It was said a long time ago there might be 3 years of darkness and then 5 years of daytime, and then 2 years of darkness and 1 year of daytime, maybe 3 years of nighttime, 4 years of daytime. When it was nighttime all the time, how many of you would like it if it was nighttime all the time, never daytime? Well, the nighttime birds and animals, they liked that. But the daytime animals, they liked it when it was daytime all the time. How many of you would like it if it was daytime all the time? Well, they were always arguing. And so finally one day, Eagle flew all the way up to the sun. And he said, "Oh, mighty sun, the daytime, the nighttime, the birds, the animals, they can never decide whether it should be daytime or nighttime. Can you help us out? Eagle, go back to the earth. Gather all of the daytime birds and animals on this side of the river, and gather all of the nighttime birds and animals on this side of the river. Tell them to hold a contest. Tell them to elect a leader. And whichever leader can say the way they want it to be the longest, I will make it that way." "Thank you." And Eagle flew back to the earth. He gathered all of the daytime birds and animals on this side of the river. He gathered all of the nighttime birds and animals on this side of the river. He told them to elect a leader, and whichever leader could say the way they wanted it to be the longest, sun would make it that way. Well, the nighttime birds and animals, they could not decide who their leader should be. Badger said, "I think we ought to have nighttime all the time." And Owl said, who, who wants daytime?" Finally, Bear showed up, and Bear was in his usual growly mood. And he said he thought there ought to be 10 years of darkness and then one day, and then 10 years of darkness and then one day. Now, that didn't sound fair to the nighttime birds and animals, but who was going to argue with Bear when he was in one of his growly moods? And so they made Bear their leader. On the other side of the river, the daytime birds and animals, they couldn't decide who their leader should be either. Rabbit said, "I need to feed my babies every day. I need daytime all the time, all the time, all the time." And Mouse said, "Oh, me too. I need daytime all the time, all the time, all the time." Finally, it came down to the very last daytime animal, Bullfrog. And Bullfrog, he said he thought there ought to be one day, followed by one night, followed by one day, followed by one night. That sounded fair to the birds and animals, and they made Bullfrog their leader. Now, before the contest even began, Bear, in his usual growly mood, Bear started yelling in his very loudest bear voice, 10 years of darkness, one day. 10 years of darkness, one day. 10 years of darkness, one day. When the contest began, Bullfrog sat on his side of the river saying, "One day, one night, one day, one night." Now, have you ever heard that, Bullfrog? If you ever go down to a creek or a pond on a late summer evening, if you listen very carefully, you'll hear Bullfrog saying that very thing. One day, one night. Well, Bear was not used to growling for long periods of time, and after a while his voice gave out. 10 years of darkness, one day. 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 Well, after a while, Bear's voice gave out, and he went down to the river, and he took a big drink of water, and his voice came back even stronger than before. 10 years of darkness, one day. 10 years of darkness, one day. Bullfrog sat on his side of the river saying, "One day, one night, one day, one night." Bear, his voice began to give out again. 10 years of darkness, one day. 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 Bear went down to the river, and this time he drank even more water. But this time, his voice did not come back. And that day, we all know who won the contest. It was Bullfrog. And ever since that day, Sun has made it so that we have one day, followed by one night, followed by one day, followed by one night. And I think that's a pretty good way, don't you? That's the end of that story. The last story I want to tell you today is a story that comes from many different nations. It was the Iroquois-speaking people, the Passamaquoddy, the Pequot. Some of them eventually got moved into our area, and they were the Wyandot and the Shawnee, that the county of Wyandotte County and Shawnee Mission are named after. And this story comes from them, and it's called Glooscap. Now, Glooscap was a very important mythological creature in Iroquois mythology, but he did not know everything. And at the time this story takes place, Glooskap is living with Grandmother Woodchuck, and he said, "My grandmother, I have done everything. There is nothing left for me to do. I'm going to pack up my bags and move along." "Ah," said Grandmother Woodchuck, "there is one who lives in the village not far from here, who has even more power than you." "But I am Glooskap, the powerful one. I helped the Creator put the white puffy clouds in the sky. I helped him put the color in turkey's feathers. I helped him with everything." "Ah, the one you are looking for lives in the village of the people not very far from here. His name is Zidziz, and he lives in the lodge of Nagaways." Glooskap said, "I will go. I will find this Zidziz. I will take his power." And Glooskap traveled for many days. And he finally made his way to the village of the people. And when he got to the village, there was an old woman sitting outside of her lodge. And Glooskap went over and introduced himself. "I am Glooskap, the powerful one. I am looking for one called Zidziz. I heard he lives here in your village in the lodge of Nagaways." "Yes, right over there. That is the lodge of Nagaways. That is where you will find the mighty Zidziz. It is a good thing you have waited now to come, because he is just awakened from his nap. Otherwise you could not have seen him." "Thank you." And Glooskap thought to himself, "This one is so powerful they will not even awaken him from his nap." But Glooskap went over and he scratched on the door, the deer hide door of the longhouse. And a very pleasant voice invited him inside. And he went in and he said, "I am Glooskap, the powerful one. I am here to see one called Zidziz. If you are Nagaways." "Yes, I am Nagaways. And there in the floor, there is the mighty Zidziz." And Glooskap looked down at this hideous little creature. It had no hair on its head. It had no teeth in its mouth. It was ugly. "Ah," said Glooskap, "this will be even easier than I thought." And Glooskap set himself down in front of the mighty Zidziz. But Zidziz paid him no attention, even after he introduced himself. And finally, Zidziz took off his moccasin and he began toe play. Well, after a while of toe play, Glooskap said, "Ah, that is where he keeps his power, in his toes. I can do anything he can do and better." And Glooskap took off his moccasin and he too began toe play. Well, after a while of that, Zidziz, still paying him no attention, picked up his foot and stuck his big toe in his mouth and began sucking on his big toe. "Ah," said Glooskap, "that is where he keeps his power. But I can do anything he can do and even better." And Glooskap got his big toe into his mouth and he too began toe sucking. Zidziz still paid him no attention. And finally Zidziz picked up a little leather turtle and he stuck it in his mouth. "Ah," said Glooskap, "that is where he keeps his power, in his medicine turtle. I will take it and I will have his power." And Glooskap took that leather turtle. And Zidziz began to cry, and he began to scream, and he began to yell. It was a horrible noise. "Ah," said Glooskap, "that is where he keeps his power, in his medicine song. But I can do anything he can do and better." And Glooskap began to sing his very powerful medicine song. It was so powerful that all of the winds of the world became still, and all of the bodies of water were calm, and there was no sound in the world except for right in the middle of Nagaway's lodge, where Zidziz was still screaming and crying. And finally Glooskap could stand it no more, and he said, "Can't somebody do something about this hideous noise?" Nagaways had been watching what had been going on the whole time. And Nagaways reached down and she picked up Zidziz in her arms. And she began to rock him back and forth and sing him a lullaby, patting him on his back. In no time at all, the mighty Zidziz was asleep. And Glooskap left and he went back home to Grandmother Woodchuck and he said, "My grandmother, you were right. That Ziz is a powerful being. He has a horrible medicine song, but there is one who has even more power than him. That is the Nagaways, the mothers, the life givers of our world. Ever since that day, fathers have told sons, grandfathers have told grandsons, uncles have told nephews, and I have told it to you. I too honor the Nagaways, the mothers, the life givers of our world. Wado, thank you. Thank you all for listening today. Please be sure and fill out the evaluation forms. It helps the library a lot. So thank you all for stopping by and listening to Two Crows and his stories today. Bye now.